Welcome back, everybody. We're delighted to have you here this evening for a wonderful panel that I think will be very helpful in, connecting some dots for on the things that we talked about earlier. But before we get started, we have some words of welcome from our President and CEO, Dr. Mike Boyle.
Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. I wish I could be with you in person. We actually have our own board meeting tonight. So I'm going to be there with you in spirit tonight, but I look forward to seeing you tomorrow night to hear the report of how things are going. You know, this is the CF Foundation's 18th March on the Hill, and over the years we've had over 1,000 volunteers come to Washington, D.C. to make their voices heard on the Hill and to tell their story. So we're so glad that you could be part of that tradition. This year, more than 100 of you will participate on our March on the Hill, and your personal stories when you meet with members of Congress on issues that are important to the CF community are going to make a difference. We're proud to welcome so many members across the community. So our National Advocacy, our National Volunteer Advocacy Committee, our chapter advocacy chairs, and our congressional captains. So welcome, welcome. You're the leaders who are spearheading our advocacy efforts. And I'd say, if this is your first time, get ready to experience just how powerful the CF community is. We know the energy you bring, we know the passion that you bring, and it's going to drive our mission forward. Now, your ability to amplify the voices of people with CF everywhere throughout the community with your own stories is the key here. Your stories help policymakers understand the impact that their decisions make on the lives of people with CF. And we always say, no one can tell your story like you can. There's nothing more powerful. So get ready for that and get ready for the impact that it's going to have. Now, in terms of what we're talking about, we know that our path to a cure, these new medicines for CF, all flow through two critical agencies. One is the National Institutes of Health, and the other is the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. Our partnership with these institutions over the years has really driven our progress in CF and will continue to be essential as we move forward for a true cure for every person with CF. You know, we work with the FDA on a regular basis to help gain approval for these new therapies. We saw this with the highly effective modulators, and we work with them to get these new therapies into the hands of people, your loved ones with CF. And those for you who are participating virtually, your new therapies. And we have a long tradition ourselves of funding research, but our efforts are really in combination with the NIH, which has even larger amounts of funding for some areas of science that will push forward these continued new therapies. I also have to mention another thing, which you're going to be talking about, and that is Medicaid. Medicaid is such an important source of coverage for nearly 40% of people living with CF, including half of all CF children and 1/3 of adults. So tomorrow you're going to advocate to ensure that we continue to have this critical assistance because so many in our community rely on it. And now tomorrow you're going to be focusing on these issues. And remember, every time you advocate, you're laying the groundwork for the future needs of the CF community, and including making sure we have access to those life restoring therapies, and also reminding Congress that the CF voices need to be heard. So on behalf of the CF Foundation, I just want to say thank you. Thank you in advance for telling your story, for the mission that you're embarking on tomorrow, for your passionate commitment to the CF cause and to our shared mission to make CF stand for Cured Found. We know that by being on the Hill and sharing your personal story, you're going to have a critical role in shaping policy ahead for people with cystic fibrosis. And if there was ever a time where we need you, now's the time. So good luck. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow night and hearing about your great success.
Well, thank you, Dr. Boyle. Very appreciative of those kind words, and we're certainly ready. This community is fired up. I could tell from the conversation earlier. So to get us started, I'd like to introduce three of my colleagues here with us tonight. The first is Dr. Patrick Thibodeau, our Vice President of Basic Research, Dara Riva, our Senior Director of Clinical Research Programs, and Dr. Whitney Brown, Vice President of Clinical Affairs. So thank you, Patrick, Whitney, Dara, for joining us tonight. We're excited. Before we get the program started, maybe just introduce yourself and tell everybody a little bit about yourselves. I'm sure there's some folks here that you've met in the past, but Dr. Brown, let's start with you.
Hi, good evening. Thanks, Dave. I'm delighted to be here. I wish it were in person, but the weather's always so unpredictable. But I'm Whitney Brown. I'm an adult CF physician, also lung transplant trained as well. I have been working for the CF Foundation since July of 2021. And I'm now 80% effort with the CF Foundation and clinical affairs, supporting care delivery throughout the country, thinking about building the workforce of clinical workforce in terms of physicians and care team members that are going to take care of people throughout their lifetime. And I continue to see patients 1 day a week at local care center Inova Fairfax in Northern Virginia. I'm glad to be here.
Great. Thank you, Whitney. Dara, let's go to you.
Thanks, Dave. And thanks, everybody, for joining us this evening. I also wish it was in person, but the weather, we better be safe than sorry. So I'm Dara Riva. I'm the Senior Director of Clinical Research Programs at the CF Foundation. I started in 2017, but my work really started with the CF Foundation much earlier because I have 2 children with cystic fibrosis. So my role at the CF Foundation is really to oversee our investigator-initiated clinical research programs. What does that mean? It means the researchers that have great research ideas or have study ideas, they can apply for funding here at the CF Foundation. If it's good and we think it's going to help people with CF, then we will be able to fund that. So that's my job.
Great. Thanks, Dara. And you have another connection to the CF community, so maybe you just want to share that as well.
Yeah, I'm definitely part of the community in many, many ways. I have 2 children with cystic fibrosis. My son, Max, is 15, and my daughter, Penelope, is 13, going on 18. So.
Great. Thanks, Dara. Thanks for being here. Patrick, over to you.
Thanks, Dave, and thank you all for joining us this evening. It's unfortunate we can't be together, as everybody has already said, but I'm happy to share with you a bit this evening. Patrick Thibodeau, I actually joined the foundation along with Whitney. We were in the same HR classes coming through in July of 2021. Prior to that, I was a biochemist and cell biologist who worked on CFTR structure and established mechanisms by which modulators could act on CFTR at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, and prior to that at UT Southwestern Medical School in Dallas, Texas. So I've been in CF research for about 26 years now in a couple of different capacities, but really excited to join you here this evening.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you all. And obviously, the support for the NIH and the FDA allows organizations like the CF Foundation to continue our progress in treatment towards our ultimate goal for a cure. And without this critical support, innovation can't exist. So I guess let's start, Patrick, with you. And I think we sort of left the introductions in a really good spot. And we have a really long history of really complementing the work of the NIH through the CF Foundation. Can you talk to us a little bit about, just give sort of a high level overview of some of the research that's come out of the NIH and why it's been so critical to our progress in finding treatments for our community?
Yeah, absolutely. NIH funding has been essential for advancing therapeutic development, our understanding of the disease, and our development of care models in CF for decades now. If we go back, into the 1970s and early 80s, the NIH provided funding that helped us understand salt and ion water transport across epithelia. This was before we knew there was a CFTR or what CFTR was. In the 80s, the NIH provided a lot of the funding that led to the cloning of CFTR. In the 90s and early 2000s, the NIH provided essential resources for us to understand what mutations did to CFTR, and more importantly, how we might be able to revert those mutations with things like modulators. And in fact, that was the work that laid the groundwork for the development of assays and experiments that identified the modulators and brought those into, ultimately brought those into the treatment regime we have now. This has really run alongside what the foundation has done historically, and our two funding streams really complement one another in many cases, where the dollars that the CF Foundation provides to our research community are often complemented by multiple dollars from the NIH. And it's that synergy that has allowed us to build research centers, to build critical infrastructure, to develop the tools, and really to advance the science for the development of therapeutics. And that, like I said, that includes modulators, that includes antimicrobials in the anti-infective space, that includes a lot of our thinking about diabetes and GI disease today. And it is very impactful in all of our path to a cure genetic therapies space as well. In fact, many of the technologies that you've heard about over the last few years, CRISPR-Cas as an example, came out of NIH-funded studies, in that case, about bacterial viral defense and the immune systems of bacteria. And it's the development of those tools using NIH dollars that really powers our ability now to interact with companies to develop therapies specific to CF. So that funding has been really an essential cornerstone of support for our research community.
Very helpful. We've had a lot of questions about some of that, early work, and so really great overview. We've also been talking a lot about. We're talking a lot about funding, NIH, FDA, and at sort of the basic level, I think it's hard for folks to sometimes understand exactly like what is a grant, what goes into it, how is it reviewed, what are some of the costs associated, and obviously that's a lot in the news right now, impacting our community. We've been talking a lot about indirect costs that we can get into a little bit later. I'm sure there's going to be some questions on that. But can you just, what does it mean to get a grant? What is a grant? What does it sort of look like from the researcher side of the ledger?
Certainly, yeah. And as a researcher, the grants are the lifeblood of all your activity. Getting a grant is a high point of an academic year. When you get that award, it's normally a very competitive process that starts with the granting institution publishing what we would call an RFA, or a request for application, that either broadly or specifically describes a scientific question that they feel needs to be addressed. That then allows investigators to think about how they might employ the technology and their knowledge in their labs to address those questions and come up with the answers that hopefully lead to some advance in care or therapeutics. So from the investigator's point of view, the researcher's point of view, they would look at the published lists of priority questions. They would formulate a research program to address those questions specifically, and then submit that to the granting agency, either to us or the NIH or CDC or Department of Defense, any number of different granting organizations. At that point, grants normally go through a very rigorous review process. In the case of the NIH, grants are distributed to experts in the field. There are at least 3 independent investigators or researchers that review the grant and score the grant, and provide really critical feedback on the science that's proposed, the merit of the science, its ability to address the question, and the feasibility of accomplishing what's being proposed. All of those 3 things together, if the grantee or the grant submitter rather is successful, would lead to an award that would be made by the granting institution. And at that point, the research would begin, and the granting institution would then go into a monitoring process where, for the duration of the award, there would be regular check-ins with the researchers to make sure that they're doing what they said they were going to do in the application, that progress is being made appropriately, and that any adjustments to the research plan due to changes in feasibility or understanding of the science are implemented so that the funds being applied to that research are being used as effectively as possible. That's a fairly active process in many cases. For us, for our CF grants, for example, we have grants that we monitor on a monthly basis. But that could go from anywhere between, say, the high frequency of about once a month with a check-in to maybe once every 6 months to a year on other grants. So that monitoring process goes on throughout the course of the grant. You brought up indirect costs just a minute ago. One of the things that obviously is associated with grants are dollars, and that's what allows us to do the research and keep the lights on. And just to quickly address that, when we issue grants, when the NIH issue grants, there's two principal financial components. One is what we call direct costs, and that's the money that's directly used to do the research, to pay for the investigators, for the doctors, for the experiments. That may pay for lab time, it may pay for clinic time, it may pay for any number of things, but it's the money that is used to do the experiment and get the data to try and answer the question. But if we think about that, that work has to be done in the context of a hospital or a university lab setting where there's a building, there's electricity, there's water, there's other overhead that comes in. We need administrative assistance for accounting and bookkeeping. We need regulatory compliance and legal affairs. All of those dollars are indirect to the research. They're essential, but the dollar that's spent there doesn't contribute directly to getting the experiment done. And those are the indirect dollars that we've heard a lot about in the news the last few weeks. I would just say that those are really essential to the activities of the research enterprise and ecosystem. It doesn't do much good to pay for an experiment if we don't have a lab to do the experiment in. So they go hand in hand. There's a lot of that probably needs to be adjusted. And I think we can get into sort of the dynamics of the situation that are going on later. But that is an essential part of our granting process, both at the foundation, at the NIH, as well as all other grant issuing entities, and one that contributes basically to the productivity of our investigators.
Super helpful as we kind of think about I think a lot of the questions we may get from Congress tomorrow, and moving forward. I want to give you kind of one more, and I think this a little bit will bring us into some others. We have talked a lot today about the importance of the NIH and the FDA and the overall landscape of drug discovery, right? And sort of how it impacts how one type of research in one space might impact another. And how can you talk a little bit about how we interact with the NIH and the FDA to facilitate our therapeutic development, but also how it might impact discovery in other spaces? In other words, how does research build upon itself? How do we learn from other spaces? I think sometimes that gets lost in translation as we think about the importance of research and funding science. We're not doing it in a vacuum or in pillars. And can you talk a little bit about how this contributes to the overall landscape of innovation and development moving forward?
Absolutely. So I think the CF Foundation has a really productive set of interactions with both the FDA and the NIH. And I think it's important that we continue to maintain that dialogue so that we can both be as productive with our resources as possible. I do want to say that the CF Foundation does not receive money from the NIH, nor do we support the NIH. These are parallel efforts where our interactions are largely reflecting on the community's needs and the directions that the research ought to go. In some cases in informal settings, and in other cases in very formal settings. As an example of that, we routinely run with the NIH workshop series where we identify the most pressing questions that our patient community has and develop white papers or priority documents to direct the research community to address those most pertinent of questions. I think the types of informal interactions that we often have is to reflect on the types of grants that we see, the pivots that we would like to see in the research community. And we can have minimal influence on what is prioritized at the NIH, but we certainly have a lot of insight into their portfolio as we think about trying to shape that work. In terms of the broader ecosystem, I think one of the powers of the NIH is that they fund research across so many disciplines. And the example that I brought up a moment ago is a great example of this. CRISPR-Cas was not developed because we were thinking about gene therapy. It is the tool that has revolutionized gene therapy over the last few years. But that was funded because people were trying to understand how bacteria became resistant to viruses and how bacterial immune systems work. Once that technology was identified, researchers that were funded by the NIH then could apply it to all kinds of different problems, including CF. And some of the most exciting work that we have in the academic space and now in the preclinical drug development space all rely on those fundamental developments that were supported first by the NIH in fields that would never have come to the CF Foundation for funding. And if they had, probably wouldn't have been funded by us because it's not really an on-mission moment. The final bit of that is that the infrastructure that's needed to support research, to have models that would include access to clinical samples, maybe animal models, cell culture models, the diversity of technologies that all are applied at our CF research centers. Because they're supported by the NIH, it allows us to take advantage of this broad group of technologies that are underwritten by a variety of different funding sources and that we would not be able to support on our own. So it's that total ecosystem and the synergy that comes from working in parallel with other diseases and other funding organizations that's really allowed us to accelerate our research and ultimately our drug development efforts.
I got one more for you, and I think this is going to help us transition a little bit more into the FDA space and a little bit more towards for Dara. But just at a quickly high level, can you share a little bit about how the NIH helps bridge the gap between basic science and translational and clinical research? In other words, how do we get from what you've been describing into a place where it's coming to patients' hands a little bit closer to where we needed to get to patients' hands?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe I'll start with just the definition of some of those things that, we talk about basic science. Basic science actually turns out to be fairly complicated most of the time. But basic science refers to sort of the generation of fundamental knowledge. And it's what people would picture if you said, I'm a biochemist or a cell biologist in a lab with a white coat and the nerdy glasses. And I can say that because I was one of those people for a long, long time. That is development of knowledge and our understanding of the universe and the world around us in many cases. Translational science is what we would say we're going to take that basic knowledge and apply it to benefit someone in the clinic with a therapy or a treatment. And it's translating that from the basic science space to the clinical space. And then the clinical space is probably most people would rationalize is that monitoring patients, interventional and observational trials, changes in care, where the scientific aspect is to improve human health directly by modifying behavior or treatment therapies. The great example of this is the development of GLP-1 agonists that we've all heard about with Wegovy and Ozempic. The basic science was identifying that those little peptides, the drug, actually binds something to the cell and causes the cell to change its behavior. The translational component of that was to recognize that, I've developed this thing that impacts the cell. I think I can take that and run a clinical trial if I make it a drug, and that we could impact the outcome of people with diabetes. And then the clinical side is the monitoring of that. And the NIH really supports all of those. They support the basic science, obviously. There are grants that facilitate the development of translational tools, early stage company formation and development. And then there are grants that support clinical trials and clinical trials networks. So the NIH plays really an important role across the entire spectrum of research.
Thank you. Incredibly helpful. So we know clinical trials are the things that bring the drugs to market. I mean, that's our high level talking point. That's what we tell the Hill. The NIH does the basic research. The FDA brings the drugs to market. and they're becoming more complex, as we think about, investment into genetic-based therapies. Dara, can you tell us a little bit about how the NIH supports the clinical research and how the TDN, the Therapeutics Development Network, is fortified sort of by NIH funding?
Yeah, and I apologize if I'm frozen. I hope everybody can hear me okay.
We gotcha.
Great. So let me take a step back and describe what the TDN is, or the Therapeutic Development Network. The TDN was established in 1998, and really the goal was to bring some expertise of clinical research from care centers and bring them together so we can really facilitate the movement of clinical trials from phase 1 all the way to phase 3, all the way to the FDA approval in the fastest way possible. So really bringing these centers together to work together to get these drugs to market. So that's what the TDN really is. And the TDN does more than just industry research. It also does research for our investigators or our researchers here at your care centers or at institutes near your care centers. And when they apply to the NIH and they want to use the TDN as their coordinating center, or as the group of sites that will be doing their research, they will include a letter of support from the TDN in their application. And the TDN has a great reputation, especially with the NIH, and in their ability to actually get clinical trials done and get them done quickly. So this letter of support actually is very helpful in getting funding for these researchers. When they have that TDN support, the NIH is more likely to say they can get this work done. They have the support of the TDN. And then it goes back again to those indirects, right? So when we get that funding, the TDN really utilizes those indirects. It helps keep that staff, helps keep that space at Seattle Children's for them. So again, really important to have that indirects for the TDN and in improving our abilities to get these clinical trials to market. I also want to note that we do have a great relationship with the NIH, as Patrick has mentioned, and we do a lot of what we call supplemental funding for projects. So when the NIH has something that is funded that may be related to CF, and we want to also help with that funding, then we will provide some supplemental funding. And then vice versa, when the NIH has a project and they're done with their funding of that project, then they may ask the foundation, do you want to pick this up? And that can, an example of that is CTOT, which maybe Whitney can tell a little bit more about that. So again, great working relationship. Having NIH indirects really helps that therapeutic development network, and again helps us get those trials through.
Great. So the NIH has sent a bunch of, excuse me. One thing that we might not think about when it comes to NIH funding is the Institute's role in career development and sort of building that bench of researchers and the workforce. So, Dara, can you talk a little bit about that? And Whitney, maybe weigh in here as well, because I know this is a really important part of your role and how we're thinking about, continuing to bring folks into the CF space.
Yeah. So you can't teach research in a classroom. So you really need to have hands-on experience to learn how to do research and learn how to do it well. And that's where the NIH really steps in and helps provide funding mechanisms for folks to find those mentors and supply support for those mentorships. There's also funding opportunities for young investigators to get startup lab funding, right? This is so important because we need to continue to draw researchers into CF. And, even though we might joke that our researchers never retire, the fact of the matter is that they do. And we have to always make sure that we have the next generation of workforce coming up. So these training grants, these career development grants actually are very important in helping maintain our CF research workforce.
I almost think about it, Dara, as like a relay race. The synergies between the NIH and and CF Foundation, it depends on what exactly we're talking about, but there's a lot, when we talk about someone's career, maybe they'll start with an early stage career award from the CF Foundation and get introduced and get a little bit of money to explore an idea that they have, and then be able to apply for a larger grant with the NIH. Or maybe it's the other way around, that they start at the NIH and then hand off the baton for CFF funding. But it's sequential through the career. I mean, we synergize, and one without the other is not going to be as effective. So I was just thinking of sort of that relay analogy, and what made me think about it is the CTOT. You mentioned the clinical trials and organ transplantation. This was a multi-center effort that the NIH funded. I can't remember exactly for how long, but let's say 10 years. They dedicated funding for 10 years for lung transplant programs around the country to collect samples from people who've undergone lung transplant, many of whom, actually very significant portion of whom had CF, to study their blood, to study their, or to bank it. There were some studies initially, but sometimes you don't even know what you may want to study in the future. So to freeze blood, to freeze lung samples, to see what might, what we don't know right now, but we might know in the future, and we want to look back and study it, and to characterize what happens over time after lung transplant. And then the funding period ended, after a certain time. And we were able, as a CFF, that was another relay handoff, is that we didn't want to see that go to waste. All, the samples, the manpower, all the effort on the behalf of patients and their families to invest their time and energy in being part of it. And so we picked up, and now are funding the next. We're maintaining the research samples, and we're offering opportunities for other investigators to tap into it. We're not and still learn things from it. So I think of it as like a really effective relay race, and we need our partners.
It's a great analogy.
Yeah, I love that analogy. That's one to use tomorrow. Thanks, Dr. Brown. Super helpful. I wonder also, we've talked a lot about the NIH so far, and we've talked a lot about the NIH today, and obviously we're advocating for a lot more money to go to the NIH than the FDA. But the FDA is such a critical part of, bringing 16 CF therapies to market, including 5 CFTR modulators, and the 5th one, just recently. Dara, can you tell us a little bit about our relationship with that agency, and how important it is to really getting the therapies across the finish line?
Yeah. So I think the FDA has a reputation of being this very stern, rigid institute that doesn't have much flexibility. But I can say that is wholeheartedly not the truth, especially with our relationship with the FDA. I want to remind everybody about the drug Orkambi. When that modulator came through, it wasn't as impressive as we've seen with Trikafta in terms of outcome measures. And the FDA was not sure that they were really ready to approve that drug. But they allowed patients to come in and describe their quality of life on this medication. And that alone was enough for them to approve this drug. So I want you to remember that this FDA, they're people and they care, and their priority is safety, but they are 100% willing to help us get any of these new therapies over the finish line. Another example is when we, the modulators only affect, certain mutations. However, there's a lot of mutations that we don't know if modulators will work or not. And we're able to test cells in the lab and test them with modulators to see if maybe those mutations would be responsive. But if you think about it, we can't do clinical trials for every single mutation that we have in CF, especially those ultra rare, where we may only have 4 or 5 people in the world that have these mutations. So what the FDA allowed, and this was the first time that they've done this, is say, if you can show us that it works in the bench with the person's cells, then we will allow them to have that mutation on the label. And again, on the label is so important because that's what insurers are looking for. Is this medication on the label, or is this illness on the label? So again, the FDA really proved itself to being open, to being, willing to have new ways of looking at things, or new ways of approving drugs, specifically for CF. So I say our relationship with the FDA is really important and very strong. And we really need to make sure that we have that funding for them, so they can have that staff, so they can continue to work with us, come to our meetings, come to our workshops, and meet with us and talk about novel trial designs. It's very important that we maintain that relationship, and they have the staff to really work through these trials.
Yeah, such important points about the label. Whitney, I feel like you were about to jump in.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that to your point about the FDA, they have exhibited also very forward thinking, and they're very patient centric. One of the major outcomes that matters to them is how patients feel and function on the medication. So when you're thinking about designing a medication, yes, we have FEV1, yes, we have exacerbation rate, but they came out several years ago, and they want to know how people feel and function. And so that kind of changed our outlook on, yes, that does matter. We knew that mattered. That's, in fact, it may be number one, especially for people with CF and their families, but to have that brought into the discussion, and and they generally do have open, whether it's public hearings or virtual, they do allow that opportunity for people and their families to speak up and weigh in on that. And then as a result, clinical trials usually build in some sort of quality of life measure. And that was based on their guidance. So I think that's really important.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
And, we do, hear a lot that the FDA drags their feet, and they're so, adverse to approval, and we really haven't seen that in CF. And I just want to give this last example of the latest Aleptrek was approved in a little over 24 weeks. So the Vertex submitted that over the summer in July, and it was approved by December. And again, it's just a testament to our relationship with the FDA and them understanding, what these modulators are, how we're able to show that they work in clinical trials, and how we're able to get them the data quickly using that therapeutic development network. So don't hate on the FDA is my message to you all.
No, all great points. I particularly like the one that you said earlier, Dara, about the label. Just, that's what's important that's what gets it covered by your insurance. But it's also, the same is true for label expansion, right? We've seen, modulators expanded. We see kids now benefiting as young as six months of age. And that's the thing that, this is the agency that's allowing our loved ones at really young ages to have access to these, these therapies that are life-changing and are going to, change the face of CF moving forward. So we certainly need a well-resourced FDA to have those staff in place to do that, particularly the ones that know the disease so well, that our colleagues here are doing the work to educate them so that they know the disease, they understand. I think that human aspect that you talked about, Whitney, is so important and a critical point too. They're not just reading numbers on a page. They're really concerned about the human aspect and the patient-centric approach, which is aligned with our own. So we've talked a lot, you've made an excellent case for the synergies between these agencies, and beyond research, these partnerships advance improvements in care, and how, patients receive care, to your point earlier, Whitney, on just sort of that patient-centric approach. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of the partnership in clinic, and how the partnership is continually evolving, and what you see in your clinic and in patients?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we all recognize that a lot has changed. That's understatement, over the last 5-6 years, for many reasons, for pandemic reasons, for modulator reasons, et cetera. But what hasn't changed is the fundamental partnership that does exist between people with CF and their care teams and their families. And so I think we've led the way in CF in terms of being very patient-centered and promoting shared decision-making and sharing information and tailoring, designing a plan that meets individual needs. But I will say that we have historically been a little bit of a proponent of one size fits all, meaning that we had said, everybody should come every 3 months to clinic, and here's the test that you should have, and that was based on very good evidence that if you have cultures, if you have PFTs, if you come to clinic, we're going to find out if you're sick earlier. We're going to do something about it, and we're going to treat you and make you better. But what we've realized in the midst of all of the change in how people are feeling, or the variability of the CF journey now. For many, nothing has changed over the last 5 years. For some, everything has changed over the last 5 years. And then there's, of course, the care delivery of telehealth that's become possible. I mean, there's so many things that are different. And we're seeing progressive aging in the CF population. More and more adults, now an adult predominant disease. So all of these things taken together have led to us thinking, yes, nothing changes with that fundamental partnership between people with CF and their care teams, but maybe we need to allow for more different journeys and acknowledge that, and give people a framework to tailor care, to individualize care a little bit more for the patient that's sitting in front of them. Because care teams want to do the right thing, and they want to follow guidelines. And so if they've been told, see people every 3 months and here's the tests that you should do, that's what they do. But now what we're realizing is that there's, CF is a journey through life, I don't have to tell you guys, and there's ups and downs, and there's times where people may need less care. And there's times where people may need more care, like pregnancy or like major transitions in life. And so last fall, the CF Foundation sponsored a group of clinicians from around the country, all different disciplines, and people with CF and their families, in what we call a position paper, which means it's not hard evidence based on clinical trials, but it was a review of all the evidence out there and sort of the prevailing best practices, and put some parameters around what does it mean to individualize care. Based on the person sitting in front of you and their disease manifestations, and also their priorities and preferences. And so there was a framework that was presented of looking at health, not just lung health, but mental health, GI health, nutritional health, looking at all the different components, and hopefully being able to have a conversation about how often should you be seen? When is the next time we'll see each other? And will that be over telehealth, or will it be in person? Just accounting for the fact that people need different things, and it can go up and down, from year to year. And so we're really excited about that guidance and the flexibility, and care teams are absorbing it. And we want to allow flexibility, but we want to make sure that care remains high in its quality and nothing is compromised. But what I'll say to all of that is that assumes that you have access to care. Coming in to see your CF team and having these important conversations about when and how you're going to be seen next. And if you're aging with CF, or if you're experiencing complications and you need to go and see other providers, all of that relies on the fact that you have insurance coverage to see those providers. And so, that's something that's on our mind as care teams, and people and their families, is that's so foundational. It seems so basic, but it's a number one worry for a lot of people, and a reason why they may delay getting care from their care team.
So I think what you're touching on a really important point. Well, a bunch of really important points. But let's just stick with the coverage one for a second. So we're talking about the importance of Medicaid tomorrow as well. So we've been talking a lot about the NIH and the FDA. We're also talking about the importance of coverage in through Medicaid. Can you talk a little bit, what you see with your patients, and how do you think about Medicaid as a provider?
Medicaid is fundamentally important. I think it varies from center to center what percentage of our patients are receiving Medicaid either as their primary or only form of insurance, or maybe as an add-on with another form of insurance like Medicare or in some situations private insurance. But what we heard from Mike, I think in the intro video, is that we're talking about approximately half of kids and like a third of adults relying on Medicaid for coverage. And Medicaid is sort of like, I have TRICARE insurance because my husband's retired military. It's kind of like if you play in the club and you follow the rules and you get your, you get your referrals and you do, and you stay in network, it can be, it is excellent coverage. Sometimes there are hiccups if you want to go rogue without a referral and this and that make it problematic. But in general, I would say that it's a very, very viable form of insurance, and care teams are used to working with it and are really appreciative of it. Now, what's become challenging, it's always been challenging, but we know about Medicaid expansion, that was like really nice for people with CF and care teams, so that some people became newly eligible for CF in certain states. And I'm not an expert on this, and you probably prime the crowd on all the details, but expanded Medicaid is something that has been really, really, really helpful. And I'll just give you an example of one of my patients at Inova. So a 42-year-old woman who qualified for expanded Medicaid, meaning they raised the income requirement in Virginia. And so she was newly eligible. And during the pandemic, that was really, really helpful, because she lives 4 hours from our care center, like in the corner of Virginia near Tennessee. And, and there was transportation reimbursement with Medicaid. She could come to her visit. She could get mileage. She could get her drugs paid for. I could refer her for her diabetes to our endocrinologist. We could get things covered. But unfortunately, last Thursday, I had a telehealth visit with her because she lost her expanded Medicaid on January 31st. And I don't know the details of her family income, but now apparently the family income exceeds the requirements, and she's working with Compass to try to find, a marketplace insurance that they can afford, but it's a catch-22. And I did a telehealth with her and assured her I wouldn't bill, because she was so distraught about, she didn't want to have a visit and be stuck with a bill that she couldn't afford. And so she is working right now because she has advanced lung disease. She really, in my mind, should be on disability, and I told her such, but she doesn't have enough Social Security quarters to get disability. So she's got a few more quarters. So she's working part-time, but then by working part-time, that impacts the family income, and then you don't qualify for Medicaid. So it's incredibly hard. People are doing the right things. And I've told her, like, carte blanche, she cannot work full-time and get employment-based benefits, because she's not healthy enough. So we're stuck in that space. And thank goodness we at the NCF have the Compass program to actually refer patients to and to walk them through. So she got a list of every medication she's been on, and she wanted a list of every IV antibiotic so she could compare plan to plan which one they're going to be able to pick up out of pocket. And I hope they can do that. But it causes a lot of it kicks up her anxiety. I understand why. I'd be very anxious. It causes a lot of distress for she and her family, and then also for us as a care team, because we want to help her. And we can only do so much. But I will mention, Dave, that like as care team members, we want to do more, because we want to do more for patients. It makes us feel powerless, like many people feel, and I think we need to find our voice as well. And Dave was very kind. On February 3rd, we actually had a group of PACE awardees, and PACE means Program for Adult Care Excellence, and that's a program that the CF Foundation sponsors. It's a 3-year career development award for, it's mostly people who just want to take care of patients, but they say, I want to get more involved in adult CF care. Most of them are pulmonologists, but some of them are internist, family practice. I want to do more in adult CF care. I want to dedicate my career and become an expert. And we had them to Bethesda for the first ever meeting. And some of them said, can we do something? Actually, I didn't say march on the Hill. They didn't know what that was. Can we do something to advocate or speak out and this was actually a request before the inauguration. This was a request, and we planned this back in, what was it, December, Dave? They just said, we're in DC and we want to like speak out on behalf of people and their families with CF. And so it became even more timely on February 3rd when Dave and his team arranged for 15 physicians to march on the Hill in person and go to different offices. And they were blown away by the very simple stories they could tell and the impact it had. And some of the staffers asking for them to email like a written summary of the story so that they could pass that on and augment that. So I guess my message is what you're doing here is important, and care teams are right alongside you, and we want to use our voice as well. And thank you for doing that tomorrow.
Yeah, it was a huge shout out for you. You gave a lot of shout outs, so I'm gonna reiterate them. One to Compass, because we love Compass and all they do, but also, I mean, our care teams, your care teams are just they're all in, and I got a chance to experience that in a big way along with Mary and Ashley, who actually did the lion's share of the work. So I don't want to take credit for putting all the day together, but we had a great day, and we really, I think what was eye opening, I think in that moment, was that I think our care teams live in data, right? You're like, where's the data? How do we improve based on outcomes based on data? And the Hill just wants to hear stories. They like the data, but they want to hear the stories. And
yes,
hearing about somebody getting kicked off Medicaid in a state that has like the best reputation for a Medicaid program underscores what we were talking about earlier around work reporting requirements that add that administrative burden. That's one of the proposals to reform Medicaid right now, that adds that administrative burden. And we've got physicians talking about people getting kicked off easy Medicaid programs just because of a lapse in judgment or something simple. So, and then and that story went on to talk about rationing a modulator, and we know that that's not good at all. I want to circle back to something you said that we didn't touch on. And Whitney, you brought up your patient managing diabetes. Can we just quickly just talk about some complications? And I think, both, what you're seeing in the clinic, but also how has the NIH helped advance research in CF complications like CFRD? And maybe I'll just a jump ball. Start with whoever wants to take that one to start, and then maybe what we're seeing in the clinic. Back to Whitney.
I can get us started. So I can give one example. There's many, but this one example is probably one of the more recent ones. I hope everybody has heard about the bionic pancreas. If you have not, please reach out to me and you have CFRD. It's probably one of the biggest technology advancements in CFRD. But the device, the bionic pancreas, was actually developed for type 1 diabetes. And the NIH was the funder for the pivotal trial to get the bionic pancreas approved for type 1 diabetes. Now, in that grant, the NIH allowed a small group of people with CF to be included in that trial. Now, knowing that CF was not going to be on the label for the first time that it went through approval. But that pilot data was sufficient enough for that company to say, we can do this in CF, and we think it can work in CF. And with that, now we have started funding the bionic pancreas trial for CF. And again, the importance of that is getting the label CFRD on that label so we can get this bionic pancreas approved by your insurers. I could talk days about the bionic pancreas, but I'll send it over to anybody else if you have any other examples of NIH and complications.
Dr. Brown? Yeah.
Yeah, I could chime in.
Dr. Thibodeau, go.
Yeah, so, one of the things the NIH has done in the basic science space is to become really innovative, engaging new investigators in diabetes in particular. And so NIDDK, one of the 27 institutes at the NIH, actually piloted a program with our CF Center at Dartmouth University that has had both NIH and CFF funded CF Research Center for a long time now. And it's a really unique opportunity where the NIH has allocated money to Dartmouth to go search out and identify and recruit diabetes researchers in to work on CFRD from around the world. And this is a really unique paradigm that shifts the scientific decision-making in the review of grants from being at the NIH to now being within the CF Research Center, guided by CF experts, including members of the CF Foundation as advisory committee members, as well as a variety of other experts in diabetes. So I think, they're really willing to partner with us both to think about the clinical space, but really to think about all the basic science that needs to be done to understand the mechanisms underlying disease as well, and being really creative and breaking some of the molds that they've historically used to fund research. And I think a lot of that is driven by the fact that we've had such a productive relationship with the NIH over the years, and that we've had established research centers that have been going for, in some cases, decades now, that have brought both scientific and clinical advances forward at a really exceptional rate.
Did we lose our fearless leader?
I was wondering if it was just me.
Yeah. I can give another example. The NIH funds groups of centers that work together to solve a problem. And the NIH, I think this was probably, I want to say 10 or 15 years ago, they funded what we call the CF Liver Disease Network. And this was a group of sites that probably conducted the largest trial we have ever done on CF liver disease. In fact, it was probably one of the first trials that my son was enrolled in to do as a clinical study when he was 4 years old. And the goal really was to understand who may be at risk for developing CF liver disease, and looking at different ways to measure that through like ultrasounds and other imaging technologies. And now they've gone even further to look at other different ways of looking at the liver and trying to identify those that may be at risk, and even what are some treatment options if possible. So again, just finding ways that the NIH has really looked at CF and funded a lot of research that we wouldn't have been able to fund on our own. But knowing how important CF liver disease is to us is what really helps them understand what they should be funding from a CF perspective. Whitney, you were going to mention something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it goes even beyond CF. There's few scientific developments or breakthroughs in this country that haven't been touched by NIH funding. And there's so much crosstalk. CF is a multi-organ system disease, as we know very well. And so as you bring up liver, we talked about diabetes. That's a shared space for many other people without CF that, in the country as well. So they're funding not just our CF studies, but, general studies in liver disease and fatty liver, which, by the way, affects some of our CF population, and diabetes, even though it's not the same as type 1. I mean, it's a lot of really piggybacking on developments in other spaces. And one that just came to mind in the care realm is HIV. So the NIH has been, a major funder of HIV research for years and years. But when I think about the transformation that happened in HIV, and I don't know how many people are aware of it, but they got these highly effective antiretroviral therapies that have changed the course of disease for HIV, where they're living much longer with the disease, and now they're facing complications of aging. There's a lot of parallels, that we're seeing, that it's the sort of the mentality switch between a terminal disease to a chronic disease, and what does that mean for general health issues? And so the NIH has been key in funding not only just HIV, like how do you kill the virus kind of research, but what does that mean for cardiovascular disease and people who live in a chronically inflamed body? And so, what does that mean for lipids, heart disease, kidney disease? So many things, so many areas of crosstalk that we benefit from, that the NIH is funding, that it's not even directly related to the CF space, and I think, all of the trials are publicly available online, what's being funded. Not all of them end in publications, but a lot of them do. And I think even indirectly, that propels us forward, even if the study is not labeled as a CF grant.
You're muted, Dara.
Dave's going to join me.
I said there was there's Dave.
Oh.
There's a question in the chat, Patrick, and I was going to see if you could answer it. The question is, are the people who issue grants political appointees?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually a really important question. There are political appointees at the NIH at the highest levels, but the decisions about grant making are really left to two groups of people. One is external scientists who weigh in on the merits and the technical relevance of every grant, and then professional staff that are career at the NIH that are vested in the science and are scientifically trained in the areas that they oversee. So again, as a grant comes in, the very first step is the grant is submitted and it goes out for review, and external advisors to the NIH or the CF Foundation weigh in on the validity and merit of the grant. They typically assign a score to the grant, where the higher the score, the better. And, the highest scoring grants tend to be the ones that get funded, without going into the intricacies of that. But that's all driven by experts that are independent in the relevant research arenas. It has nothing to do with politics. These aren't even NIH employees, and they're not CFF employees when we do grant review here as well. And we rely on really world-class scientists to help us make the decisions about how good the science is. The decision to fund the grant, once those scores come in, is largely based on budget and then the need to do the type of research and the value in the portfolio. And that is managed, again, by staff scientists at the NIH that are career people that are heavily invested in the community. These are the folks that we talk to on a regular basis to make sure our priorities are aligned. They come to conferences. They meet with us at NACFC most years. The CF representatives from the NIH are there listening to the science and trying to get a feel for what's needed in the community. But no, they're not political. And the politics in Washington tends to stay away from the individual grant-making decisions. It does affect policy and high-level strategy for some funding. But at the individual level, good science is recognized by world-class experts and the NIH staff as scientists.
Thank you, Patrick. I hope you can hear me. We had a computer malfunction, so we're just good thing Whitney's. Yeah, we're teaming up here, so you got us both in one box. I also know that there's the issue with the QA features not working properly. So if you want to just pop some questions in the chat, that's fine. And actually, it looks like we're not seeing a live chat here. So Patrick and Dara, I'm going to defer to you all if you see any. The last thing we see here is just more of a comment from Maureen. But if there's any questions, let's go ahead. We're here to take your questions, and happy to answer what we can. Anything coming in fresh, Dara or Patrick?
Not that I'm seeing.
Okay. Let's just give it another second since I think folks. Anything on your end, Patrick? No?
Nope, you might give it a second or two, but
I hope we gave a lot of examples for people to use tomorrow.
I think we did. I really do love the connection you made with the label expansion, Dara, and then just the way to be able to kind of explain that, I think, is really critical, because it doesn't stop when a drug's approved, or we haven't seen that, right? It's like the first approval is not the last role that the FDA plays in our story, and it's a really important point that I think that often gets missed. And it's also, I think you're right. The other thing that you said that I think is really important is oftentimes the FDA gets a really bad rap, and Mary touched on that earlier, is that the FDA, people like to really poke at the FDA, and that's it's just such a critical agency to make sure that, Dr. Brown has what she needs to treat patients. And I thought the label expansion was a really good example for people to really put their finger on and share tomorrow. So I'm not seeing anything else in the chat. That means that we must have done pretty well. Go ahead, Patrick.
Oh, there is a question that just came up, Shelby, and that is there a simple way to explain to my parents about NIH and funding CF and how CFF isn't funded by the NIH? So I
think you just did it, Shelby, but go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, I'm happy to explain that a little bit. Again, the NIH does not fund the CF Foundation directly. Our ability to fund research really came off the backs of all of the fundraising efforts of our community historically for, the decades of commitment that you all showed to your families and friends and to our research community by raising the money in great strides and all the other events that we have, and providing those resources to our community. And that is historically how the CF Foundation has supported our research workforce. At the same time, the NIH does fund some of the same investigators, but the process is in parallel but independent to anything we have. So our dollars don't go to the NIH, NIH dollars don't come to us, but our investigators are often asking both us and the NIH to help support research. They're not allowed to ask for the same thing, but often they'll ask us to fund part of a study and the NIH to fund a different part of the study, or there'll be some complementarity there. So again, we get the synergy from having two funding streams coming into our community. But the important thing really here is that we don't fund the NIH directly, and that's intentionally, nor does the NIH fund us directly, and they're just parallel independent streams.
No, I was just going to say, when you were talking, I was like, the relay.
The relay, that's right.
Yeah. And I think that what I was taking away from that is that it was a really important point. They're not allowed to ask for the same thing.
Yes.
And one
no
of the
double dipping.
Double dipping. And I one of the things that we've heard from folks that don't think the government needs to be involved in as deeply as it is in our space is that, well, the private sector can handle it. And I think this is a really important point that you just made, Patrick, is that we're not handling it. We're funding different but complementary work, and that needs to be something that we distinctly share with Congress, because we can't have one without the other, and we certainly can't do it in the private sector alone. So really important point. We're not seeing any other questions on this end. I must have the touch where the technology just stops working when I come in. So thank you for, and not only did she let me share her square, she gave me her chair. So
it's all good.
Thank you, Whitney. Anything else coming in?
Not on my end. I don't see.
We'll take that as a sign to wrap up here, or a little earlier than expected. And I just want to thank you all for your time and energy, but most importantly, your work on behalf of people living with cystic fibrosis.